Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Homeschool Minnesota. My name is Dale Anand. I'm so glad you guys are here with us today. Homeschool Minnesota is a podcast outreach of MÂCHÉ, Homeschool Minnesota, Association of Christian Home Educators. We're so glad that you guys are here. Today, as you guys know, some of the things that we like to talk about on this podcast are obviously homeschool related, but also parenting related, things that we can talk about to get our kids really grounded in their identity and who they are in Christ, how Jesus works in them, how God works in them, the things that we can do as parents to encourage that in them. Today is no exception. Our guest today, Dr. Neil Shenvi, wrote a book called Post-Woke with Dr. Pat Sawyer. And so I'm very excited to talk to him today. One of the quotes in the book is, "A culture that has abandoned God will seek for a God substitute. People didn't cease to be religious. They merely replaced one religion with another." I found that very interesting. This is a quote from that book, Post-Woke, asserting a biblical vision of race, gender, and sexuality. And today we want to welcome Dr. Neil Shenvi to the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Shenvi.
Thank you, Dale. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so glad that you're here. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in Delaware. My parents were great people. It was not a Christian home. And I went off to college kind of being spiritual but not religious. Met my future wife, Christina, who was a Christian, and began going to church with her in graduate school, became a Christian, and then got interested in apologetics pretty soon after that. And so this is now, and then, so I fast forward, we went to Yale for her medical school, moved to North Carolina for her residency. Also, I'd gotten a PhD at UC Berkeley, did a postdoc at Yale, worked as a research scientist at Duke. But around, now 12 years ago, I quit my job at Duke to start homeschooling our 4 kids. And it's been great. I just did it on sort of providentially because of her job and our 4th kid and just family issues, but it was great. I loved it, and I've kept doing it, and it's given me time to, write and to speak and to travel. So I enjoy it.
Yeah. I love that you're a homeschool dad. I think that's wonderful. And that's a real growing segment, actually. In our state, we have several that I've met of families that the dad does the homeschooling. And what a great dynamic that is for kids. Because I have to believe that dads homeschool very differently from the way moms homeschool.
A little bit, yeah.
I would think so.
I've noticed a little bit of gender differences in homeschooling, but
that's awesome. I think it's so great that kids get that experience. That's kind of the reason why I wanted to have you on too, is that just being a homeschooler yourself, you get the culture of homeschooling. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is in the book, you talk about how we're just going to get into some parenting things and then we're going to get into the meat of the book. But you talk about how smartphones are destroying young people. I love that you said that. Can you talk about your reasoning behind that and what should we as parents do regarding technology in our kids?
So if you're interested in this subject and want to be terrified, read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Haidt is a secular moral psychologist. I think he's at NYU now. He's kind of bounced around, but he's a very good thinker, and he's amassed a lot of data just showing the horrendous effect that social media has had on younger people, especially young girls, and especially social media. It's kind of all been negative, but there's certain areas that are particularly negative. And we didn't follow great policy when our kids were little. It wasn't bad, but it was we would be even more strict today. So we did not forbid screens to our kids. It's a longer time ago. I mean, our oldest is now 17, so we didn't even have iPhones when our kids were first born. Now they're very common. So we tended to avoid like screens when they were little, but now I'd make it a policy if I had young kids today. And then social media, we were still, they're social media free. My oldest is 17, second is 15, 13, and 11. And there's no social media, and they won't have it until they're probably 18. Wow. They do have cell phones because they're driving, which I think is a safety issue. But again, just limit the apps they can download. And if you, again, read the book for more confirmation that it really is good for your kids' mental health, for their development, to just very strictly limit screen time in general, phone usage, etc. And I think if you want personal evidence, look at your own phone addiction. That's
Yes.
that's just the sad truth is that they're imitating us. And how do we think that they, with these young, underdeveloped brains, are going to be more resistant to the seduction of technology than we are as 40-year-olds? I think so.
Right.
That's what I would say. Yeah, put in place some pretty strict phone policies. Try to get your community, if you're part of a community, to agree with them. Like our homeschooling community is pretty strict on no phones during the community day,
Mhm.
and that's been good for the kids. They get to play and then go outside and talk to each other and not stand near sit there with their phones in their hands all day.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, it's something that there's lots of data on, and increasingly even secular people are realizing this is a real danger to kids.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that. It's just so true. My husband and I, a lot of our listeners know this, but we actually our kids grew up overseas because we were missionaries
Mm,
in a developing nation. And so cell phone, I mean, they had just the dialer phones you could text,
yeah.
but that was it. You couldn't take pictures, you couldn't, so that's what our kids grew up with. And the shocking thing coming back to the States for like furlough or something and walking through an airport and everybody is staring at a screen and
Hmm.
our kids were just kind of looking at everybody like, what's wrong with these people? And I'm
Hmm.
like, they don't talk, they don't interact, they don't look each other in the faces anymore, and it was very jarring for them as children to see that
Hmm.
and to understand what they were looking at. And so I can imagine if you had grown up with that just being normal, how that would just affect just the way you are and who you are. Okay, so getting to your book, I mean, that's in the book too. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
just pulling that out of thin air. That's in the book. But I want to get to some more of the quote that you said about how we trade one religion for another. And
Hmm.
I think it's really hard for people to look at the wokeness that we are dealing with um, as a religion. Can you explain why you think that?
In the first part of the book, we explain that wokeness, it can be used carelessly, like anything you don't like is woke. I've seen that
Right.
on social media, but it does describe a real cultural phenomenon, which in our book we explain is downstream from an ideology called critical theory, which goes back to Karl Marx. And we go through the intellectual genealogy. It's very well documented, and there are plenty of footnotes if people want more information. But wokeness today is an expression of the set of ideas we pick out four that describe a whole way of viewing reality. So the social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and social justice. So briefly, these woke artifacts in our culture are a product of these four ideas. Number one, the social binary says that society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, physical ability, mental status, etc. All these different categories. So there's men oppressing women, there's whites oppressing people of color, there's straight people oppressing LGBTQ people, there's Christians oppressing non-Christians, and so forth. You say, well, that doesn't strike me as plausible. I'm a woman, I'm black, or whatever, I'm disabled, I don't feel oppressed. Well, you have to understand idea number two. So critical theory has redefined oppression not in terms of cruelty or injustice per se, which is how the dictionary defines oppression, but in terms of what they call hegemonic power. So hegemonic power refers to the way that the ruling class, whether it's whites, men, or heterosexuals or Christians, they impose their values and their norms and their practices on culture in a way that seems objective and neutral and rational and even God ordained. But
Mm,
those norms and values really serve to justify the power and the privilege of the ruling class. So all of us imbibe these nebulous values and norms as sort of common sense, but really they make us blind to our own privilege, make us blind to social injustice. So that's the case. We're all sort of trapped in this fantasy world. How do you escape? The third idea is lived experience. That oppressed people, whether it's women or people of color, LGBTQ people, that they can see reality as it actually is through the lived experience. So because of that, they have inherent authority to tell the rest of us, hey, you're trapped in this unjust system. And their end goal is number four, social justice, which they define or redefine as the tearing down of all of these systems and structures that perpetuate the social binary. So they want a society in which there's no oppressive norms or oppressive values at all, that we all share power. We have this promised land of a diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, that's a broad philosophy.
yeah.
That's expressed in things like Drag Queen Story Hour, in safe spaces, in various kinds of segregation, racial segregations that's sort of
Yeah.
coming back into vogue, I guess. But in a myriad of ways, we document in the book all of these things that you identify rightly as woke, rightly. They come from this philosophy. And is it a religion? Well, I mean, you don't go to like a place of worship and worship some woke deity, but you do evaluate all of reality in terms of those four big ideas. This is where you hear phrases like my truth or your truth, right? The
Mm,
idea that lived experience dictates what we can know as the truth. This is where we get ideas like, all whites are oppressors, or blacks can't be racist because they are part of the oppressor group, and racism is redefined in terms of who has hegemonic power. It's where you get things like 87 different genders that you can choose from because the gender binary itself is the product of the patriarchy. So anyway, in our book, we go through all of these
yeah.
concrete expressions of wokeness, but point out that it's more than just weird stuff happening. It is the expression of a very coherent and centuries-old set of ideas.
And it's been happening for a while. It's not like they
Mm,
just came up with it to be like, oh, let's do something different. It's been something that if you look back on the history and you really take a picture of what history, like what we've been learning in schools. I mean, I graduated in 1987. So that was,
mm,
pretty a long time ago. And I remember some of this stuff kind of creeping in just a little bit in my very small town Minnesota high school.
mhm,
And I think about that and I think, gosh, I guess I didn't realize that multiculturalism was going to lead to what we have now. But it did.
mm,
And at the time I just thought, oh, it's cool to learn about different cultures and different and it could be too that my teachers were coming at it from that perspective more so
mm.
than the perspective that they do now. But why should we as Christians care about what's been happening in our culture? And how can we be engaged in what is happening when it comes to these topics?
So in the book, again, we document why we should care. Because
Mhm.
people say, well, the culture does weird culture stuff.
Yeah.
That's expected, but it's not going to harm the church. Well, we say, no, that's not true. One example we give is Dr. Christina Cleveland. She had a column at Christianity Today magazine 10 years ago. She was speaking at, Lifeway conferences, Cru, Campus Create for Christ conferences, InterVarsity conferences. She's a big name in evangelicalism, and her theology was pretty normal evangelical theology, just standard Christian Protestant theology. And yet, in 2022, she publishes a book entitled God is a Black Woman. She says things like, if God is a Black woman, then she is a Black trans woman, obviously. So, it's just
Wow.
Sophia. So she now worships a being that she calls the sacred Black feminine. She rejects the biblical God as one word, lowercase white male God. She views the Bible's God as oppressive and patriarchal, et cetera, et cetera. And the book is suffused with the sensibilities of critical race theory and queer theory. So that's in a span of like 7 years. She went from major platform on
Wow.
major evangelical institutions, conservative institutions, to completely apostatizing. And how did that happen? And our point is she followed the ideas to their logical conclusion. It's not like she was some aberration. She was
Mm-mm.
just consistent. She's like, well, if I believe, this is an example we give in the book. If I believe that all our societal norms and values are really social constructs, which basically they are there to justify the power and privilege of straight white males, well, then things like the gender binary are oppression.
Mm.
Things like ideas like hard work is the key to success is oppression. Ideas like one religion is true and others are false is oppression. It's privileging your Judeo-Christian tradition or your Christian tradition or whatever it is, that's a privilege and it should be destroyed. All of those ideas followed logically lead her to where she is today. And I've seen this personally in our book. We start with anecdotes from our own personal lives of people that have been in our churches, but that were friends of ours and that have gone off and shipwrecked their faith or at least ruined their theology
Yeah.
because of these ideas. So it is something we have to care about. And one thing I'll say finally, there is this triumphalistic narrative out there in the culture in 2026 that all of this ended when Donald Trump was reelected. We were done with wokeness. Donald Trump killed it. And that is just not true. In
Yeah.
the book, we point to data showing things like this. Uh, if you ask if you ask baby boomers, older people, they say there's an ideology that says that white people and Jews are oppressors and everyone else is oppressed. Do you believe that ideology? 80% of baby boomers say, no, that's ridiculous. And 20% say, yes, I do believe that. For Gen Z, the numbers are exactly reversed. 80% of Gen Zers say they believe that whites are oppressors and Jews are oppressors and that everyone else is oppressed. Okay. So
Wow.
another example, about 1 in 4 Gen Zers identify as LGBTQ. Identify. And there's data point after data point saying the young kids are not radically based or whatever the phrase is. No, these young people who are going to be our next crop of politicians, presidents, judges, lawyers, doctors, pastors, for the most part, they are still imbibing these bad ideas.
Mm.
We have to prepare our kids to deal with that, one, from their peers, two, from their professors in college, three, from their workplace HR supervisors, wherever they go,
Yeah.
they're going to be exposed to these ideas. So we have to equip them. We can't just close our eyes and hope it all goes away.
Yeah. As a homeschool dad, one of the things that I think about for you, talking to your children and teaching your children, is I think about, topics like this. And I think about, okay, so like how they're masked in Christianity. Like our church has embraced a lot of these topics and thoughts
Mm.
and wrapped them up as Christian values. So like I think about like social justice. God is a just God. His justice looks very different from the justice that we get in the world, especially in our country today. And I think about how do we, when you have a child that is compassionate and is tender-hearted
Mm.
and does want to reach out to those who are being oppressed, like legitimately oppressed,
Yeah.
and wants to stand in the gap for those people. How do you help them to determine the difference between today's social justice and really biblical thinking on what God's justice would be in that situation?
That's what our book's for. We have,
Yeah.
as you know, we have definitions of justice and how the biblical justice contrasts with modern progressive notions of social justice. We're very clear, do not jettison biblical justice or biblical compassion because it's misused by progressives. That's
Right.
ridiculous. We
Mhm.
stand squarely on the Bible. I do worry about a pendulum swing where people, especially young people who have been raised in this extremely woke culture, they swing too far to the other side and say, well, I'm not going to care at all about justice or
Exactly.
oppression or racism. Those are all made up words. And we're like, those are biblical words. You
Mhm.
can't throw
Yeah.
away just the biblical ideas and doctrines. It's good that God is a defender of the fatherless and widows and orphans. It's good that he is compassionate. It's good that he seeks justice for the oppressed. So we try to thread the needle between accepting wokeness, and we've seen that's the wrong path, and then rejecting anything that's even remotely sounds like wokeness, which
Mm.
sometimes means rejecting the Bible. So
Yeah.
we want to stay firmly planted on what God's word says about these topics. And that's your answer to how do you guide kids. I think one danger we point out is that some parents, they want to shelter their kids from woke ideology, which to some extent is good, but another extent can be dangerous because the first time they're exposed to any of this stuff is when they leave the home for the first time. And sometimes they can even, as parents, you can shelter them from the messy and frankly evil realities of things like chattel slavery, Jim Crow,
Yeah.
sexual harassment and abuse that's been going on for decades, centuries, etc.
Yep.
You can shield them from those ideas, but then when they get to college, they first hear about those actual truths of history, these actual episodes in our culture, in our nation's history. When they hear that from the first time, it'll be from the mouth of a gender studies professor. And then they think to themselves, wait a minute, this is actually historical truth. Why did my parents not tell me about this? They
Right.
begin treating their professors as if they're just magical gurus rather than just
Mhm.
fallible human beings. So the comparison I draw is to the first settlers who brought smallpox to the indigenous peoples in the Americas, right? So Europe had smallpox for centuries, and because of that, the Europeans had to develop immune systems and antibodies for the smallpox. When they came to the Americas for the first time, they brought their diseases with them, and those diseases killed lots of people. Why?
Yeah.
Because they had no immune system to defend themselves against smallpox. So we're sending our kids, if we've sheltered them for their entire lives, for 18 years, from any of these ideas at all, we've sheltered them from actual history, from
Mhm.
actual understandings of the civil rights movement, actual understandings of, say, where feminism came from, just no exposure at all. And they go and start hearing these snippets from the culture in a danger. They're like the indigenous populations, they're going to be massacred. What's the solution? The alternative? We inoculate them. We give them small doses of truth and exposure even to bad ideas within the confines of a loving, Bible-centered Christian home. So, for example, and this is one person that did this and talked about it was Vodi Bakum, who's a well-known Baptist pastor.
Yeah.
But he talked about having his kids who were homeschooled, I think, but they read Karl Marx. They read Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and
Yeah.
then but they read that in the high school and within their home, and then he would pick apart these bad ideas and say, why do we not believe this? Why is that wrong? Let's compare that to God's word. You should be doing that. And our book is aimed mainly at parents, largely at parents, because we want to equip you to understand the ideas and then counteract them using scripture.
Yeah. It leads me to your chapter about thinking well, thinking biblically.
Mm.
And I love that chapter. It really breaks arguments down, and it talks about, the different topics that we've just discussed and how to kind of address it in a biblical way, but also to have those arguments and those conversations. I think about like Charlie Kirk, how he would
Mm.
go out onto the college campuses and he didn't know what he was going to be asked or what he was going to be, he had an idea. There was all kind of the same stuff, I think, anyway, but and he had those conversations, and it opened up people's hearts and minds to
Mhm.
be like, well, gosh, maybe there is a different way to look at these things. And I think about that, and I think, our children need to be taught that, and they're going to be taught that in homeschooling. I mean, that's the best possible place for them to have that conversation is in your home. So where you talk about these topics logically and the importance of understanding the argument. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that with your children? What does that
Sure.
look like with your children?
One thing I start with is a basic biblical worldview. I'll give a story about how this affects all these hot button issues indirectly. Well, I always tell my parents, class teachers, things like that. I say you need to be the first person to talk to your kids about these
Yeah.
hot button culture issues like transgender, homosexuality, abortion. You should be the first voice they hear about that from. It's like, I don't want to, shatter their innocence. I get it, but if you don't, someone else will. You do not want the first voice they hear on these topics to be coming from the internet, or
Yeah.
Reddit, or some random person from his classmate. So, but how do you do it? You can do it in an age-appropriate way. So, for example, from the youngest time, with our kids, they would understand boys and girls as kind of natural thing. But we would talk very openly about the difference between boys and girls biologically, different designs that God has for us, things like that, how the gender is talked about in the Bible. It's a good thing, just very naturally. At one point, I think when my son was about 7, my oldest, I was like, it's time for us to talk just about LGBTQ stuff very generally, age-appropriate way, but he has to hear it from me first. So I went I took him aside and I said, buddy, just want you to know, in our culture today, there are people who are boys, but they think they're girls, or they're girls that think they're boys. And I just talked to him that exists in our culture today. And he thought for a second, and he has, he's one of 4, he has 2 boys, 2 girls. So he has sisters, thought for a second, age 7, and he goes, why would you not want to be a boy? Sorry, we said, what's wrong with being a boy, right? Or no, what did he say? He said, he put it in a positive way, but he's like, it's good to be a boy and it's good to be a girl. He didn't think, well, who'd want to be a girl? That's a terrible thing. Or
Yeah.
his innate intuitive response was, they're both good because God designed both of us.
Yeah.
It doesn't come from me teaching him the details of queer theory. It came from being rooted in a biblical picture of reality. Of course, what God made is good. Of course, who'd want to turn away from what God made to something else? So that's how these topics, when they come up, hopefully your kids will immediately default to a biblical lens. Another example, this is really funny. But it is actually true that kids do not pick up on race. And I can go into the reasons why that's the case. But my father's Indian. And so my father is notably dark skinned. And at some point, I think we were talking about in history, the civil rights movement and racism is just naturally coming up in our curriculum. And we talked about how, during American history, Blacks originally were brought here as slaves. They were enslaved and laws treated them differently and unfairly throughout history. And so I had to explain, though, what does black mean? And so I said, okay, well, these kids in your co-op, they'd be called black. And my kids had they didn't call kids, they would call them dark skin. They didn't have a category called black and white, we just didn't bother to tell them that. But eventually we had, those kids, your friend so-and-so, and they're black. And they're like, wait, they're not black. They're brown. This is like, they're like 7 or 6 or 7 years old. They're just like, no, they're brown, trying to educate their parents. And then they said, wait. So is Pop black? That's my dad. I said, no, he's Indian. They're like, whoa, hold on. His skin is darker than her skin. So we had, and so that came up naturally. But the point of something beautiful is that they had to be, unfortunately, trained to create these categories, which then made no sense. It took months.
Yeah.
But the beautiful thing was, we're like, you know what, buddy? It is silly, isn't it? it is silly that we'd create these buckets that don't make logical sense in this. Like, yeah, you're right. Pop-up's darker than they are, and I pointed to my daughter all my kids are quarter Indians, so my one daughter has very dark tan skin, especially in the summer, and my other daughter has beautiful long. They all have red hair. It's weird genetics, but it's just a beautiful example of how if you raise them with a Christian worldview, the world's lies or even just errors just don't make sense to them. They're like, why would you put people in these weird buckets that don't make logical sense? I'm like, yeah, okay, fair. Good point. So that, and in terms of like, if they get older, yeah, you should know enough about critical theory to answer their questions, to even raise issues. Like, so for example, you should be able to talk to them about what justice is and what vision of justice is proper and biblical versus the counterfeits. In a sort of fairly nuanced way. One other fear I have is that if your kids go to college and then come back home and ask you, wait a minute, in college we read Ibram X. Kendi or we read Robin DiAngelo or Kimberly Crenshaw. These are all critical race theorists. They come back home and they say, well, can you tell me what critical race theory is? And you say, it's just Marxism. And they say, no, wait, no, it's more complicated than that. You say, no, it's not. I watched this video on YouTube or TikTok and I know it's Marxism. And I just spent I spent a year in Sociology 101 learning about the difference between Marxism and critical race theory. But you can't offer them any real pushback because all you know is what you heard on Twitter or Facebook. Now, I am not shaming you. I want to prepare you to have thoughtful conversations about these ideas, because the first step in critiquing, the first step is understanding. If you don't understand properly, you can't critique properly. It's why we always aim to start with understanding, sort of neutral, fair treatment of the subject, and then move to critique, which is always needed, but has to come after understanding.
Yeah, it's so good. And your book is great for that. Like here it is, you guys, right here. I haven't shown it yet. If you are a parent, I don't know how. I mean, honestly, this is an important book to have. And I say that a lot, but this one truly, get it for your family, because it is going to break everything down for you as a parent without having to go through a college class to understand these things. It really is. And it's going to give you a good understanding. And I like what Dr. Shenvi said about how we have to understand first to be able to have those conversations with our kids when they come back to us from say a college campus, and they're like, well, I learned this, and this, but now you've got some kind of an understanding of what it is that they're talking about. So you're not just giving them general answers, you're actually able to get specific with them. And that's what this book will help you do. That's why it's an important book. I think sometimes Christians forget about reaching out. I loved that one of your chapters was on reaching out, and reaching out to others and the Great Commission. When we're talking about such divisive topics, we don't look at it as a way to share who Christ is and God's actual worldview, the biblical worldview, with others. We just look at it as, well, this is an argument time. And I love how you guys approached it by breaking it down to our children, our neighbors, our community, our job, our workplace, all these different things. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so important that you included this chapter in this book?
Well, we wanted it to be, a book to send you out. That's the Great Commission. We want not all of it, but many of our endeavors to be pointed outwards to reach the world for God's purposes. And that means engaging lots of different people, starting with your kids, certainly, starting with your local church, other Christians. I get it. But then also, reaching neighbors, reaching non-Christians. And one thing I think is often an obstacle and reasonable, and we actually mention it in the book, people say, well, I don't want to distract people from the gospel. Talking about these are political issues, cultural issues. I want to primarily tell them the gospel and only then maybe later disciple them into proper understanding gender, say, or race biblically. Okay, I understand that, and that's actually a fair response. But what I would say is that sometimes these issues are the stumbling blocks that have to be removed before they'll even hear the gospel. And that's number one. So in other words, as I do apologetics too, I help explain why Christianity is true and can be known to be true through reason and evidence. And 20, 30 years ago, the big obstacle to apologetics was the new atheist movement. And they were all about reason and logic and evidence. You had to tell people, no, Jesus is not a myth. He really existed. He really died on the cross. Yeah. There's evidence he rose from the dead physically, and I can make that case from history. So that was the objection to Christianity. It's not true. That's no longer the most common objection. The most common objection today is it's evil and oppressive. So as an apologist, I have to start answering that value obstacle, right? Before I even get to the factual obstacles. In the same way, if someone says, I can't believe the Bible because I don't care, frankly, whether it's true or not, I know it's evil, which is an odd way as a scientist for me to think about reality. I'm like, no, truth comes first. Your preferences come later. But for a lot of people today, it's like, I know it's not true because I don't like it. So we should do some work trying to say, actually, well, first, I'd say you got to put truth in the foremost. But second, to correct their misunderstandings of what the Bible teaches, if they have any. Or also, and if they don't, they have to understand properly, the Bible teaches there are two genders. I'd say, well, yes, there are. But you can't avoid the offense that God's truth gives them. That's not on you. That's one issue. So, but you can want to talk about it in a winsome way. For example, one way we talk about in the book, a lot of people are very insistent that the Bible's vision of a gender binary is oppressive and evil and uncompassionate to transgender identifying people. And what we say in the book is, okay, it's good that you want to have compassion. Compassion is a virtue. But compassion has to be rooted in truth. And one example we give is if you met an anorexic girl who said, I am fat, I know I'm fat, I feel fat, I want you to call me fatty, and if you don't call me fatty, you don't love me. We would not call her fatty and say, well, I'm being loving. We would say, honey, I won't call you fat because I love you. For me to call you fat when you're actually starving to death would be an act of hatred and cruelty. It's not in spite of my love for you that I tell you the truth, it's because of my love for you. That's how we should approach transgender identifying people, is saying, it's not that I hate you, it's that I want what's truly good for you, which is to embrace the gender God's given you. And so that's how you can frame these discussions. You don't have to just come down with a hammer. You can say, hey, this is motivated by my love for God and my love for you. And even people that disagree with you in the end, maybe even hate you, I've experienced that they're more open to that understanding if you present it honestly as a desire to see them, blessed and fulfilled in Christ. So that's one issue. Another issue is that there are people that my friend James Wood has termed reality respecters. He compares them to the God-fearers in Acts. These are people, they're Gentiles who weren't Jewish. They kind of honored the Jewish God. It's not clear whether they'd actually converted or whether they're just kind of on the outskirts. But there's something about the God of the Bible that these Gentiles respected. And James says in the same way, there's a whole class of people in our culture who've seen culture go crazy to the point they can't define what is a woman anymore. They're looking around and who's speaking sense anymore? And it answers, it's Christians. That's odd. Or, there's a case, there are several actual concrete cases. One is a woman named Louisa Perry, who wrote a book about the harm done by the sexual revolution. So she's not a Christian. She wrote a book about how terrible this casual view of sex has been to our culture and to women. But she was a secular person, but she recently became a Christian. And part of her story was, I was looking around, who else is saying that free love and casual sex, these are terrible things? Who's saying that? Oh, it's the fundamentalists. That's the
weird.
Oppressors. The oppressors. But there are people, and there are many cases of that, of people who are there was Ayan Hirsch Ali, who is a former Muslim and a former atheist and now a Christian. But there are people that are looking around a culture gone crazy for any sign of sanity, and they are finding it in Christians who believe the Bible. Wow. This is an opportunity for us not to be ashamed of what's true, which we shouldn't be anyway, but to say this is a bridge to get people to welcome them into the ground for this truth that they already recognize, which is God and his son, Jesus Christ. So, and for many reasons, we're oriented towards different groups, children, the education system, government. In every area, we want to shine God's truth in full of grace and truth. That's the way Jesus brought grace and truth.
Right. I love how you put that. It's so true that one of the things that we have to remind ourselves is that God calls us, the light of the world. And that if we lift up him, we'll draw men to us, because we're lifting up the name of Jesus and who Jesus is. And when I think about that, I think about, we can't be the light of the world if our light is not, plugged into the truth of who God is. And it's hard sometimes being the light when everybody else is in darkness and they're kind of enjoying that a little bit. And then you're the one going, bing, ding, that's wrong. It makes you stand out, and sometimes it can be really difficult. But listen, if we as a church don't rise up and address these issues in truth, in compassion, in love, and teach our kids to do the same, where is this world going to turn to? Who will they turn to? Because there will be nobody being countercultural in that way. So I loved that chapter. I thought that was unique to me to see a chapter in the book on, now we've learned all these things. We've talked about all these things. We've taught it in our homes. We're working through it as a family. Now what do we do with it? We got to get out into the world with it. We got to get out into the culture. We need to address it in the government, in the education, in, our workplaces, with other families, with our neighbors, with our friends. We have to address these things. We have to be the light shining the truth, even if it's uncomfortable for us. We still have to do it. I've not seen a book where that's like the last chapter teaches you that. And I really appreciated that. Dr. Shenvi, any last words of encouragement for parents right now who are listening, who are homeschooling? Some of our listeners aren't homeschoolers. You just come here because, you like what we cover, I guess. That's great. But for just parents trying to raise their kids in a biblical worldview, what is the last word of encouragement you can give to them?
Good. And with the way when we ended the book, which is encouraging people to rest in God's sovereignty, right? God is a sovereign God. God does what pleases him. And God is pleased to send his son into the world to rescue sinners like us. So we don't have to be terrified of the culture. I mean, we should be sad to see people lost, to see the culture broken, but we should be confident that God wins in the end. And then we have a message of life and hope for fellow sinners. It's good news. Not for good people. It's good news for bad people. That's the glory of the gospel. And so don't be terrified. Pray for your kids, teach them well, train them, then trust that God is a good, loving God. And you can entrust the most precious things in your life, your kids, to him. And so, and if you're homeschooling, that's great. I mean, that's a great way to disciple your kids well. And so more power to you. But yeah, just don't get equipped. Do the best you can, and then trust the results to God.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Shenvi. I really appreciate it. And again, for our parents who are listening, it's post-woke. So we're going to put this, obviously, all in the description of the podcast will be all the links that you need to find all the other books that he has written as well, which I'm going to assume are just as good. I have not read them, but I'm assuming they're just as good. But topics that, that as parents, and this book right here, it's, if you read the recommendations at the beginning of the book, you're just going to be like, okay, these are people I know and listen to. These are people I go to when I have questions, and they're recommending you get this book for you as parents. So can't recommend it highly enough. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you. We appreciate you coming and spending time with us today. And God bless you guys. Thank you so much, Dr. Shenvi, and we'll talk again.
Thanks, Dale.